Have you ever wondered what makes creative people tick? Where do their ideas come from? What keeps them energized? What kinds of things get in their way? Is their life really as much fun as it looks from the outside? Hello, I'm your host, Lily Pierpont, and this is ArtStorming, a podcast about how ideas become paintings, or poems, performances, or collections. Each episode, I'll chat with a guest from the arts community, and we'll explore how the most creative among us stare down a blank canvas or reach into the void and create something new. In our inaugural season, ArtStorming the City Different, we dipped our toes into the vast ocean of creativity with a focus on some of our favorite creators of Santa Fe, New Mexico. That conversation was enjoyed by artists and non-artists alike because it showed us how we can all benefit from learning how to generate something from nothing, dream bigger, charter new territories, and solve problems in new ways. In Season 2, we're going to take that concept of generating our lives with intention to the next level. This season, we're talking about legacy, art as legacy, and how the most creative among us tackle this rich and deeply personal subject. Welcome to ArtStorming, the Art of Remembrance. When an artist has spent a lifetime at the easel, in the studio, or on the stage, what happens to the world they've built once they put their materials or their media down? What does it take to turn decades of passion into a lasting public legacy? The answer to that question, or those questions, is part logistics, part strategy, and often involves a lot of complex emotions. Today, I'll be ArtStorming with Patricia Watts, a curator, appraiser, and advisor who is pulling back the curtain on the legacy side of the art world. We're talking about why artwork shouldn't be moved away from its market, the technical magic of a catalogue raisonné, and how to handle those tricky family dynamics that crop up when an estate is on the line. Now, whether you're an artist thinking about your own future, a family member of a prolific artist, or you've curated and amassed a collection of your own, this conversation is for you. So today I'm ArtStorming with Patricia Watts, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today because even though we met at this women's networking thing that we've been doing for the last several months, and I've known that I wanted to talk to you sort of peripherally, but then the last time when we were in our little breakout session, we all got to say what we were up to, and one of the first words out of your mouth was legacy, and I'm like, okay, that's it, done, because obviously that's what our whole season is all about. It's about remembrance and legacy, and it occurred to me that one of the things that we really haven't addressed very specifically is what you are very specifically addressing, which is the legacy of an artist and the importance of artists to consider their legacy beyond just the body of work. Like, how do they turn that body of work into an actual legacy? And so from what I understand from your brief introduction the other night, that's kind of what you're up to these days, helping artists do that.
That's right. But thank you, Lily, for inviting me. And yeah, I'm glad that this finally worked out. So this is great. Yeah, and this year particularly, I feel like I'm returning to it a little bit more because I do have other work that I do. I'm definitely wearing multiple hats these days. But what happened was in 2008, I curated a Ruth Asawa show when she was still alive, and I worked with a family, and I saw how they really cared for her work and made decisions as a family. And I was just like, this is the way it should be, for artists, that, families get to be involved. And also living in Northern California, there were a lot of artists who'd been making work for like 40, 50 years and had never had a retrospective or a book done on their work. And after I left the Sonoma County Museum as a chief curator there, where I did the Asawa show, I became the consulting curator for the Marin Community Foundation in Novato, which was a very large building. It was an old airplane hangar site on a former military base. And they had designed it, had an architect out of San Francisco develop this really beautiful way of having workspace with exhibition space. So I was like, wow, this could be an interesting way to, find those artists and show, 50 years of work. I could hang 150 pieces in that place. I was there for 6 years, and I did several of those shows, and the first one was called Inner Worlds, and it was actually 5 of these artists. I was used to doing group shows. I guess I wasn't really ready for the solo show at that level, like 150 pieces. But yeah, once I did that and I decided to take part of my budget that I was, the money that I was making and make a book with that. And the woman who designed that first book, Inner Worlds, she put Watts Art Publications on the back. And I was like, "What's that?" And she was like, "Well, that's your imprint." And I'm like, "What's my imprint?" And she's like, "Well, you're going to do more of these." And I mean, since I've published like 16 books, and the books that I've done just on monographs on artist estates. Let's see here, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. I've done 8 of those specific monographs for mature artists who are under-recognized. And I don't just do anybody. This has to be work that I relate with, and I come from a background of art and nature, art and ecology. So all these artists have something to do. Their work is inspired by nature, including Ruth Asawa. Yeah.
Yeah, her name came up yesterday. I was at another women's gathering for International Women's Day yesterday,
Okay.
and I was talking to a fiber artist, and so obviously Ruth's name came up because even though she's sort of in that one foot in fiber arts, one foot in, I don't know, natural organic material arts, she uses all natural fibers.
Crocheted, basically. Yeah, looped wire.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so how many of the artists that you've done your retrospectives on are now better known as a result of your having done these books?
Let's see. Of those people so far, Richard Bowman is an artist from the South Bay that I did a book on in 2018. And he was interesting. He painted with fluorescent paint.
Does that last? Is that fugitive? I mean, does it stay over time, stay fluorescent?
It does. It does. And so, he died, I want to say like 2001, 2, somewhere around there a while ago. And I worked with his niece. So in these situations, yeah, I've worked with nieces and nephews. I've worked with daughters. I haven't worked with a son yet, but that's coming up. And yeah, this was a niece, and ended up at a gallery in Los Angeles, the Landing Gallery in Culver City, which was a very nice gallery. And they had me curate a Richard Bowman show. And it was funny because the whole time I was working on the monograph, I was in residence in the Bowman house. So this niece has kept the house exactly the way it was when Richard and his wife lived there. Dick was his name. So I got to live in the house while I was doing all my research, which was incredible. And so when we did the show, one of the things that they kept telling me was that I was like, "Well, was there a black light involved?" And they were like, it was very not a straight answer, but no, you don't need a black light to see, to look at these paintings. But for the Landing show, we had a black light party. And the paintings came alive, and I was like, there's no way that he didn't use a black light. But the book was already done, so that's not in the book. And little things like that are fun. I mean, I've always enjoyed my elders. Like I have aunts that lived into their 90s, and I just loved hanging out with them, and I always did, even when I was much younger, just to hear their stories and such. So I'm really not just writing monographs about the art, although I do that. I'm really documenting their life, all the life events that influence their work. But I try and write these very kind of well-researched books that a curator at a museum could say, wow, this is, some in-depth research that I don't have time to do, and make it easier for them to, do a show and write their own books on these artists. I'm not trying to be the definitive expert on these artists. I'm just giving their work life.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's so many people out there right now. In fact, in my family, I can think of one person right off the top of my head. My aunt, who is very close in age to me because of our generational weirdness in our family, but she has a huge body of work, and she's never really done anything with it. And my young cousins have said to me often, like, what can we do? What are we going to do with all this stuff when she goes? And, unlike some of the artists that you probably represent, she has not been very assertive about getting, she's not a well-known artist. She hasn't been in galleries. I think she's shown her work here and there, but never as a career artist. She's been a perpetual producer of work, and her work is very good, but she's never really put the effort into doing that. But I'm sure there are 1,000 artists like that in everybody's families. But then how do you advise people who have that family member who has a stockpile of work? Maybe they're well known, maybe they've passed the arc of mid-career and they're sort of, no longer front and center in the art world. Like, how do you decide who to select, and how would you advise people when they have a situation like that?
I think when I started out, I had the space to do those shows, and so the books went with the shows. And I have a web page. It's wattsartadvisory.blogspot.com. I'm on it right now because I need to reference all these books, because I started in 2014 with Inner Worlds, and then I did a book for Harry Cohen. I worked with Harry before he passed. He was in his late 80s. Making work still. When I finished the book, I remember going over to his house and he made dinner for me, and we're like celebrating, the book being done. And he's like, "Do you want to see some paintings I'm working on?" And I was like, "Is this like a pickup line?" Like we went into his studio and
Come
there
see
was,
my etchings,
yeah,
right?
like all these new paintings. I'm like, "Well, those aren't in the book." So yeah, he was an incredible man. And then Marge Rector, 50 years of non-objective abstraction. She was in Sausalito, incredible painter. Arthur Holman went to UNM. I was able to work with his nieces and their respective husbands to put pieces in collections. And I definitely, I donated 3, I think, down to the University of New Mexico Museum and a couple up here at the New Mexico Museum of Art. Let me see, I did that book in 2017, so I think those donations were around 2018 before I moved here full time. And then the Bowman Show, which I mentioned, Richard Ferralla, I spent 2 years on that book, and no family members. I chose to put that one together because he had put a lot of time into like a catalog raisonné, which went to the Smithsonian. So I was able to go to New York and do research and put some time into that book. And people still call me today, like, you need to do that show, and that show will be done. It hasn't been done yet. But and then a couple local people when I got here, like C.L. Bergman, who came from California and lived here for many years. She passed away. I worked with her daughter. I never met C.L. myself. And then Shirley Crow, who's in Tsuke, who I did that book with her in 2022. But, everybody's case is different. And sometimes the children of the artist can have a difficult relationship with the work at the end because it represents the time that wasn't spent with them.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe the artist left words in their trust that they wanted someone to do X, X, and X. And so they'll hire someone to do that. I've done that. And then they just put it to bed and don't do anything else. And that's oftentimes for me very sad because there's a lot of money in that estate that this artist probably would have loved to have work out there. But I think it can be emotional and difficult for family members. Oftentimes when an artist passes, there is some money there to do something with. One thing I always tell the families is don't move the art. Like if the artist spent a majority of their life in Santa Fe, don't move the art to New York City because you live there and no one knows who that artist is there. So I'm also a appraiser, and that's one of the rules is, there are markets for artists. And if you're outside your market, you're not going to get as much money for a work or, the recognition that you will in your market. So it's important to keep the work close by to where the artists live a majority of their life.
That's really interesting. And of course, that's the question that everybody, or that's another topic that everybody sort of assumes, is that once an artist has died, that suddenly there's this spike in the value of their work, which might be true for a known artist. But in the case of my family member that I mentioned, if they've really never been out there in the market, they don't graduate to secondary market and suddenly become something just by virtue of having died. So I think it's important for people to understand that there are career artists out there who deserve for that. Now that there's no more access to the work, there's a limited body of work. That's a typical market function, right?
A lot of people did not know who Ruth Asalva was. And even though in the Bay Area we knew who she was because she did a lot of public art pieces, when the DeYoung did their show in 2008, right before my show, that show was supposed to travel to New York to the Asia Museum. I can't remember the title of the museum, but they turned it down because they said not enough people know who she is. And, she died, what, 3 years later? And yeah.
Well, that's so crazy because there's even a postage stamp with her artwork on it. So that was a function of her dying, and then she suddenly catapulted to recognition. I want to take another minute to remind you listeners that ArtStorming is a listener-supported nonprofit, and we need your help to keep the conversation going. Every dollar goes directly into programs that support our mission. That means more compelling stories, more in-depth articles, and a greater impact on our community. If you love what you hear, please consider making a contribution. Visit our website for more ways to engage, and thank you for being an essential part of our work.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know who she was. And yeah, I curated that show and told a lot of people about it, but everybody's like, huh, who's that? But after she died, then it was like, oh, really? You did? Yeah.
And was the retrospective in the book that you did part of the reason that she developed that acclaim? Or what do you attribute that?
Well, I did not do a book with that show, but the DeYoung did. And that's actually probably my favorite book on her. There's been a lot of books done, with the MoMA show. And, there's, well, the auction house, Christie's has done a book. But yeah, that first book is my favorite, the DeYoung one. Anyway, yeah, she had that good history. She went to Black Mountain College. She was good friends with Buckminster Fuller and Joseph Albers. In fact, I proposed a show in 2014 to Crystal Bridges to have the three of them in conversation.
Oh,
Yeah, it was called The Illusion of Transparence. It's an incredible proposal. In fact, I had everybody on board, but then someone at the Albers Foundation, like the president of the foundation, just, said, I have another plan, so they had to all switch gears and tell me they were sorry. But yeah, because in my show, I actually was it Ruth had made a bronze sculpture of Bucky's hand. One of the children told me about it, and I was like, I'd like to put that in the show. And they're like, okay. But yeah, they had intimate relationships of, giving each other gifts. And so I thought, well, that's interesting how the relationship between artists that develop. And those things are important. And so when I do these books, I look at who their teachers were, who did they hang out with, what were some of the events that they went to that changed their trajectory, because that's all important, even if they're not close friends. Because I think Ruth and Bucky and Joseph had years where they didn't talk, but it's those connections that, it really informed their work and kept them kind of connected. And you look for those connections.
well, and it also helps us feel like we're living in an artistic age. I mean, we look back at art history and we think about who was in Paris in the 1920s, and, and you sort of feel like, oh, if only I had lived in Paris in the 1920s. But living in Santa Fe is sort of the next best thing, because it's like
There you
Paris in
go.
the 1920s all the time. And
Right.
all these wonderful connections between artists. I mean, that's one of the things that I've loved discovering in the course of my 10 years of being here, is all the connected pieces and who has been to dinner with whom, and, who talks to who and all that. I think it's really cool. And it is part of the legacy story, right? I mean, there's a sort of whole Santa Fe arts community legacy story that could be told. And I don't think anybody has really tackled that project yet as a community arts story. But what you're
Well,
doing
they
is
don't have
sort
to
of,
be best friends, like I think a lot of those artists from the North Bay, some of them had never heard of each other, when they were younger. I mean, that's also when you look at the trajectory of a artist's career, especially if you have children, there's going to be years where you don't produce as much. I often find artists in their 60s are very productive because they've mastered their skills. They don't have the children at home anymore. Like they can just focus on their work. They're not working a job. artists today, a lot of them are just painting full time, so that doesn't necessarily apply in that case. But yeah, every family's different. It's different dynamics, and another thing, if you don't have a child or a nephew or niece who really understand your work or, are supportive, I really wouldn't put the family in charge of that. If you're serious about the work that you've made and that you want it to be out there in some form, even as a donation to a museum, it's very difficult to get into like a Whitney collection or Guggenheim collections. I mean, I feel like there are museums across the United States, especially in the Midwest, who don't have some of these artists in their collections that would be, definitely well received and appreciated by the audiences. You have to think about where an artist grew up. Some artists, especially a lot of artists here, have grown up in other states in the Midwest. So some of those museums might be better for their collections in the long run, just to show children who grow up in those same places. Oh, this woman or man grew up here and they ended up in Santa Fe, and look at all these pieces that they made, and they grew up here, like I did. That's a nice point of departure for inspiring young artists. Yeah.
Well, so what's interesting to me about what you're just saying now is that it seems like there could be an entire profession that is really just in the same way that we have galleries that represent artists, that we have a professional whose specific focus is the legacy for the artist. Like, how do you handle the artist's estate once they're gone, or even while they're still alive, to get them into those regional museums? And I didn't even really know that museums were still taking art. I mean, it seems like they're bursting at the seams, and that unless it comes with an endowment to show it, that, you could donate a piece of artwork and it would end up, in the basement archives and not on the wall necessarily. So,
well, you have to get it to the right place and the right curator who understands the connection. And, they may not be able to take all of them, obviously, because that might be a lot. And that was the other thing I was going to say. When you start looking at these collections and how prolific some artists can be, I mean, am working with artists to digitally archive their collections right now. And some have 1,000 pieces. One has 2,000 pieces, so we're going to have to assess, like, do we do them all at this point? Or let's have a goal of, like, the best 500 over the next year, 2 years, and then focus on those being donated. I think, being organized is helpful. A lot of artists are, I find, but some aren't. It does make it easier for families when the artist is organized and has some kind of database system, numbering system. That's what a catalog raisonné is. It's like a numbering system. So even the Ferralla, who I did this book on, that had his was handwritten in a notebook. And he literally, he had a numbering system, and he would draw a drawing of each piece. So you had a visual to see, so it wasn't like, he was from the 50s and 60s. He wasn't taking, iPhone images. So that was a wonderful piece of art in and of itself, was his little catalog raisonné. But yeah, you need to be organized at some level. Yeah, and then you have to provide for where those pieces will land. A book that I suggest to artists thinking about their legacy it's called Creating a Living Legacy. It's put out by the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and you can find it online, and you can download it as a PDF, or you can buy a copy from them. But that's a good book for artists to, look through and think about those things, where they want to put their time and energy.
So you said it's better that artists not designate family members. So is there a particular profession like yours of people whose job it is to help artists with this cataloging and archiving? And what would one call that? I mean, art consultant is sort of a very broad term, but what would you call that profession or that niche?
I call myself an advisor, but I'm also an arts administrator at another level. As a curator, I've developed a relationship with artists who I've shown their work. So some of the people that I'm working with now on archiving, I've worked with as a curator prior. It definitely takes time, to develop trust. And yeah, the deeper I get into it, I think now that I have like over 10 years of doing this work, that people see me as someone who they could trust, and at least to give them advice to start with. It can be expensive. A lot of artists don't have the money for this kind of thing. So it'd be great if a foundation came up with, yeah, ways to support artists to catalog their work and pay people like myself or others to help them.
Do galleries take that on in any way? I mean, we're sort of living in a new time where once upon a time, the gallery sort of was that be all end all for artists that took care of absolutely everything. And now so many more artists are taking that function on themselves. So, but do you have relationships with galleries and that they say, hey, here's an artist that we've had in our stable or whatever for 20 years. We'd like you to create the catalog for them.
Well, they have their own systems, galleries do. I mean, in the last couple of months, I've been interviewing different platforms that do archiving, and one is Artist Archives out of Colorado. And it's really more of a way to sell work online, independently of a gallery. I think galleries do use that. It's basically different software platforms that people can use to have forward-facing, public-facing visibility. Yeah, there's another one out of New York that doesn't have the public-facing visibility, and I guess you can do plugins, but they really are catering to museums and registrars. I like that because it's well developed in all the different aspects you can upload to things that are associated to a piece of work, like, a review, exhibition history, something that a registrar in a museum would want to have all that connected with an artwork, besides just the image and the dimensions and the title and all that. Yeah, I'm looking at a company out of Berlin, Art Butler, that I like because they can also create websites. So I'm going to spend a year or two to get all the works digitally archived. And if something is to happen to that artist, you have to make those plans too. Like, where does that artist want the digital archive to go? Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a new area. I don't know if someone like the Smithsonian would pay for that because the work's already done on the front end. And that's kind of what they do. They'll go into an artist studio and they'll pull all the ephemera and things related to an artist, and then they take it back and digitize it and make it accessible through their website. So there are a lot of artists out there that need this help. So it's not like there's a lack of work to do, and it's not like we're flooded. I guess galleries could even be doing it too, but I don't know. Again, it's trust, and I don't think there's a lot of money in it. Maybe galleries don't want to do it because there's not a lot of money in it. But yeah, I kind of see myself more as a keeper, someone that an artist can trust to make sure that it gets where it needs to be and is most helpful to their career. Because if you spend 40, 50 years making work, you should have some way that you can leave it where it doesn't just, get thrown away, or like the families just disperse it to family members and then it never goes anywhere, especially if
Yeah.
it's good work. Yeah.
Well, and I guess, do you find that obviously some of the conversations that you're having are with, as you said, the niece or the nephew or somebody lower in generation, but for the artists that you work with who are still living, obviously they've gotten over the hump of being reluctant to think about their own death and what's going to happen to their body of work. I've been doing these dinners at my house called The Art of Conversation with artists and non-artists alike, but I find that it's interesting that some artists are reluctant to talk about their body of work, or as so many people are reluctant to talk about the end of their lives because it's as if they'll bring it on themselves or something. But they spend all this time working with galleries, getting it to a certain point, but when it comes to what are they going to do with it later, they kind of go deer in the headlights.
Well, there's probably a age that it starts to become more important, and it depends on their health. If they're starting to show signs of aging health-wise that they know, that limits them and their capabilities, then they start thinking about it more. Yeah, if you're like in your 60s and you're in good health, you don't want to have that conversation. Like, I can wait for that. Yeah. 70s, maybe, if you have health issues, 70s, it could happen. But often when I do a studio visit, I see a lot of work. I'm like, are you archiving? And, are you thinking about your legacy? And I just put it out there. I mean, some of my clients hadn't even discussed the stuff with their children yet. And I was like, you really need to do that. This is important. And so it would take like a year or two of saying that for them to go, okay, let's do this. Yeah. Because it's acknowledging that you're going to die and that they don't want to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, and then I can think of, there's one artist in particular who I won't name, but I know that this particular artist makes a living selling their work. And so the focus is on producing work to sell the work and so they can produce more work. And the last thing they need in their universe of things to think about is what are they going to do with the work? And the conversations that I've had with this particular artist would seem that it was almost arrogant to think that their work has any value beyond the fact that they sold it to somebody who's hanging it on the wall. Now they have money to live on. And so that's their sort of metabolism is how they think about it. But they don't necessarily think of their body of work as significant or important enough that they would even thing it like that, that they would constitute it like that. What would you say to an artist like that? We're going to pause here for a moment to speak to our listeners. If you like this content and want more information on our guests, their projects, and more in-depth ways to engage with us, you can find us on artbridgenm.org or our ArtBridge Substack. Please read, follow, and share our content. Your subscriptions, shares, and contributions help us grow our artistic community. Thank you, and now back to our conversation.
Someone could invite me over and I could do a studio visit with them and look at all their work, and I could tell them, I think I could be pretty honest whether I think that how far they could go.
Well, I mean, I think that in this particular case, I mean, this is an artist who's been selling through almost every show that person's ever done. And, obviously a huge collector base. So that in and of itself, I would deem that.
Well, if they're selling so much, do they have much work in their studio? Or, oh, well, then there's nothing to archive. It's already out there.
True. But so how does somebody address legacy when there's been that level of sell-through?
Well,
I mean, it's still a legacy worth noting, right?
If they're selling at that level, their galleries should be publishing books on them, right? So they have a legacy already. They have, the books that have been done on them. To go back and try and create a digital archive of everything, that can be very hard once you've already sold a lot of pieces, especially with galleries that don't share that information. So then you kind of tie yourself up that you may not be able to ever get those pieces into a museum show unless those collectors are active board members at a museum and, rally to have a show of that artist's work done, and then they can loan their pieces. It's hard to find those pieces. That's kind of the downside of artists that have sold a lot of work. Even with Farala, he was very prolific, and there's a lot available. There's a lot I still haven't seen, and stuff keeps coming up, and there's just no way I'm going to find it. Like, it's been a lot of his collectors have died, and so I can't find, like their children or wherever those pieces landed. Sometimes, when collectors die, they goes, wherever they're living, the pieces go to the auction houses and they get sold for nothing. Like I've seen that happen. I'm like, that painting's worth at least $20,000 and it just sold for $500 because it's in a market that no one knows who it is or what it is. So I don't know. If you had a gallery and you've sold a lot and you've sold to some important collectors, it'll find its way. It's not, but it is kind of hard if you haven't done a catalog raisonné. If that person just kept making work and didn't keep like a checklist of every painting that they made each year and all the information on it, then they don't have a catalog raisonné. And it's very hard to recreate that if you've sold a lot of your work.
Yeah. Well, and also one of the things that you just distinguished earlier was that it's more than just a catalog of the work, because when you add to that the narrative of that person's life and who they knew, it sort of gives a very different picture to an artist. And I would think that even just telling that story, whether it's the biographical information or whatever, becomes an integral part of a book like you're doing, is it not? Or are they two sort of
Yeah.
separate things that you've just integrated?
No, no, I told stories around images because it tells you like where they painted it, if they traveled somewhere and were inspired by an event that happened with Richard Bowman. He was down in Michoacan in Patasquiro. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. And he saw the beginning of a volcano that just came out of a cornfield, and it really set him on a path of painting about this kind of invisible energy. And so that's important stories, and the people that he stayed with when he was down in Mexico when that happened. And like you could look at the paintings and come up with all sorts of ideas about what the painting's about and the style and, like the brushstroke, and which is what a lot of, art writers through the years and critics and curators have come to write about work that they don't have the stories on. I could tell you a story about a kind of a folk artist who's become a big name, and I curated a show that I had his work in, and just since then, that was like 6 years ago, seven. Well, no, maybe it's been like 8 years ago now. He's in MoMA, New York. Like he's showing up in all these shows, and a woman wrote an essay about it, and he was from Missouri, and he told stories, and a lot of them aren't true, and they took it at face value. And that's a whole other thing about just scholarship right now, because I think there's a lot of assumptions being made that the truth's not there. So that's also a scary part for a curator to get involved with an estate of having no research done. Like that's the part that I'm trying to piece together and put them in the canon in a way that what the important facts are. If that is something that a curator at a museum is looking for, that fits a direction that they're going with an exhibition, then that artist, can be found. But yeah, we don't know, and sometimes you can just base it on the style of the painting, the quality of the materials that they used, and what era and who they were hanging out with, and put them in context that way. And I almost got my PhD like 10 years ago, and my friends were like, Trisha, you're smart. You don't need it. It'll give you brain damage. And I was like, I guess I should be working more than, going back to school at this age. So, but yeah, I see it constantly, like misinformation with academics. And it's scary. It's scary that we have, people making these leaps and they don't know, they've never traveled. That's another thing. I'll travel, like Ruth Asawa was interned in Rower, Arkansas. Well, I traveled there and went and walked the property, and like you really have to dive in deep to really understand an artist at a deeper level that is going to be meaningful in terms of writing about them. Or
Well, there's another component to this that just is occurring to me, that one of the things that at least some artists who are maybe more representational, Ruth Asawa being a little bit more tangential to this conversation, but because you're at this intersection of the environment and art, so many artists are making comments about the state of the environment in which they find themselves, which is documentation in and of itself. So I remember a show at Site Santa Fe there were images of, I believe it was Cuba. I think it was Teresa Fernandez. And there were some images of Cuba that were painted when they first discovered Cuba. And the topography of the land and the landscape was so radically different than we know it to be now because of all the development that's happened there. But in the same way, when artists are cataloging the sort of the state of the environment or an environmental concern or issue that we are having right now, they are telling a very specific story that needs to be captured for its own sake. Right. And so you've got these very interesting interweaving stories of artists cataloging the environment, us cataloging the artist, and so on and so forth. So it gets to be this sort of Russian nesting eggs kind of thing.
yeah, someone just sent me, actually a former professor from graduate school. I made a post recently on Facebook about having a kind of like a apocalyptic dream, and he's like, well, have you ever seen that Dürer painting of like water falling from the sky. It's like from the 1400s. I was like, no. And he's like, well, John Berger wrote about it. Everybody knows who John Berger is in the 70s. And, like people probably didn't understand that painting, like he had some kind of prophetic dream and made it into a painting. They probably thought he spilled paint on like it was a mistake or something. Who knows? But yeah, context and time.
Well, given that artists are typically, I mean, one of the things I've explored in my whole first series is like, where do the creative impulses come from? Where do they get their information, their ideas? And if you accept it in this sort of new understanding of quantum world, that there is this consciousness that artists become a vehicle for, then the timeline isn't going to be very precise there. So it makes, this idea of prescient art or, being able to live or interpret multiple timelines simultaneously. But that aside, you still have these actually really real-time events where artists are making a commentary about strip mining or, something that's very specific and turning it into a whole conversation about their interpretation of the world that they're living in right then and there, which is another part of what some of the artists that you represent are up to.
Yeah, I mean, I have my own little category I call time travelers, and George Orr was a ceramicist around the turn of the century, the last 1900s, and he made these super thin pots. He was down in Biloxi, and he was kind of a crazy man. He had like a wild mustache, but people thought he was just out there, and I feel like he was a time traveler because I was like, how did he even think to make those? Like they weren't popular, and you could literally find them like 10, 15 years ago still in garage sales for nothing, and now I don't even know where they're at now. I think 10 years ago they were like $40,000 for just one pot. And I finally got to go to the museum last year, that he has his own museum. But yeah, some people are just ahead of their time. They just see much further. And a lot of the artists, yeah, I have Eco Art Space, which I came up with in 1997, a platform for artists who address environmental issues. And a lot of them can be that way, prophetic that way. And one artist was doing a project called High Water Line, where she was taking a baseball line marker and marking the 10 feet above sea level line in New York City along Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. And then like 2 years later, the big hurricane hit.
I can't think of the name of it. Which one? Yeah, that one.
That one. But then everybody thought, oh, it's prophetic. Well, I don't know. I just think that people who think about, the Earth's, cycles and what we're doing to it, like we're putting chemicals into the environment, like things are changing, and you just have to kind of, what do they say? There's multiple intelligences, and some people just have that kind of naturalist intelligence that they pay attention to the Earth in a different way than other people do who are maybe more into math or engineering. So
yeah, amazing. So do you have any of your books? I didn't have a chance to investigate fully who you've done work on. Any large sculptures or land art artists in your
no, I kind of stay away from land art.
Say more. Why? Is it too ephemeral?
There's a lot of ego involved in that. And I think I'm more oriented towards works that are, I mean, they don't necessarily have to be small, because someone like Lauren Bond with Metabolic Studio, she actually has a neon light that says artists need to create on the same scale as society has the capacity to destroy it. But that's, yeah. And it's a quote by a prior artist, Sherry, and I'm forgetting her last name, but an LA artist. But that's a good concept when you're talking about sustainability, or if you don't like that word, and that's not a favorite word of mine either, but regenerative, being holistic about your approach. And so things like what the guys were doing, in the 70s, land art is a movement from the 70s. It's not a current. People like to throw that word around, and in England they do use land art as a term to talk about like work made in the land. Like it could be small scale, it could even be walking, like an earth art. But yeah, I have my own very clear distinctions about earth, land, ecological, eco art. There's like maybe 4 or 5 different phases since the late 60s that covered a range of just, yeah, of consciousness of our interdependence with the earth. I think the land art was a little kind of like, yeah, ego driven.
Well, so I mean, I think of it, what comes to mind in that conversation is I think of something like the Dia Lightning Fields, and then I think of something like Andy Goldsworthy. And I think of those two people in very separate camps because I think of the Andy Goldsworthy as very, for the most part, very ephemeral. You know, the leaves are there and then they're not. And then the Lightning Fields, which is this sort of acupuncture needles on the land kind of
Yeah.
thing. So, I mean, which is a different vibe for me.
Yeah, lightning field is not that destructive. I mean, they're just sticking the poles into the ground. So I don't have a problem with that piece. I think when you start moving the earth and carving it and making it your own as a human, you're not honoring the earth's own aesthetics, through geological processes. And yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so how would you, so, but that's different from, say, how you would qualify cave dwellings that were created for habitation. Because those were utilitarian. You have a different relationship to that. I mean, I just am so curious about it.
Well, a cave is a cave, you're
Right.
not changing that. If you're taking clay, which is what they use, and make intaglio, like make paintings on the surface, that's a form of expression that is not destructive. You're using natural materials. There
Well,
are,
what about something like Raw Paulette? You know his work up in the you don't know about Raw Paulette in the
uh,
BLM lands up in near Abiquiu? He was a Vietnam vet who came back and created these caves that were all in
oh yeah,
interior, those sculpted
yeah,
white,
I've
you
seen those.
know, yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't seen it in person, but I've seen images.
Oh, they're
Uh,
amazing.
so was he taking a lot of earth to make those? Like, was
No,
he
no,
using
he
bulldozers
was
or?
he was excavating the interior of these caves, and so he would wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow
Hmm.
take it's a very soft kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
stone out there, and then take it out and dump it on the land. So it was like a sculpture from the inside of on the
yeah.
inside of the cave. So that was a different kind of thing. Huh, that's so interesting. I mean, I guess I've never given it this.
Well,
I've
and
never made the
that's a
distinction.
habitat, like you said. It's he's using that to inhabit. But yeah, some of the large land art pieces are really ego, and and
Interesting.
indigenous artists are not fans of that work. Yeah.
Right, right, right. Oh, wow. That's so cool. So that's also a different category than, say, a large piece of sculpture that sits on a piece of land. So that's a different kind of designation altogether, right? A piece.
Yeah, like Heiser bringing that big rock to LACMA, there's a lot of hubris in that too.
Yeah.
Um,
Or a sculpture park like Storm King. I mean,
mhm.
that's a more of an exterior museum, right?
Yeah, but they have changing exhibitions, and a lot of their pieces are ephemeral now. They'll last a year or two, and I know I have artists that are Eco Art Space members who've done work there, like Mary Mattingly planted these palm trees to kind of talk about how trees are migrating, and because of the climate changing, that nature's taking its own path, and migrating in places kind of like humans do to survive.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
I would think there'd be some really interesting stuff around birds too. I think we even have an exhibition at the Vladam that's cataloging the loss of the bird song that, you hear the birds that you used to be able to hear and now you contrast it with what you can hear now, that
Okay.
kind of thing. Yeah. There's so many different things. So what going forward, do you see yourself, how do you differentiate your eco art space work from this work that you do, this legacy work? Or are they the same thing?
Well, they're not the same thing. I mean, I didn't start the legacy work until, in 2014. So I started Eco Art Space in 1997, and I've pretty much my whole career has been working with artists to address environmental issues. So I think what happened was it was just kind of a confluence of 2008 happened, and my job as a chief curator at a museum ended. trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And for a lot of people who turn 50, going into your 50s, you think you're old and you're trying to figure out like who's going to hire you when you're old. And I was like, how can I work for myself? How can I build on my knowledge base that I already have and do work and be paid for it? And so that idea of legacy work came out of that. And I, went to NYU, I got my appraisal certificate there and started, going to all the art fairs and just really honing in on value. I'd never done that before as a curator. Like I wasn't concerned about value because I was working with a lot of artists who were working, ephemeral work, performative even. So I got into that world into my 50s. And then I don't know what, I think I was ready to put Eco Art Space to bed when I moved here in 2019. And I had worked for another membership organization for a few months and then that didn't work out. And I was like, well, why don't I just do that with Eco Art Space? And I probably could have done it a lot earlier, but it was right before the pandemic and it just took off. Like I had 500 members in like a few months. Between Amy Lipton and myself, we, my co-director or whatever, she was in New York. We had worked with hundreds of artists in our careers. So that was like a no-brainer. She passed away, unfortunately, during the pandemic in December 2020. Complications of getting treatment for cancer during the pandemic was hard for a lot of people. She suffered that. But so, yeah, I've had over 2,000 members from 29 countries join. And, this particular type of artist who's interested in, some of them have not been and are really great in their skill set and like paint, they're painters, they're, like more traditional, even something I wasn't really working with before because a lot of ecological work was ephemeral for a long time. So we have a wide range, and I don't say you can't join for any, specific medium. It's like it's open. And even if you're not what I call not there yet, I'll let people join. They may not get in the directory if their work is not really ecological. And we offer courses to help them get there, so they can try, working with natural materials or, changing, a lot of the stuff too is toxic for themselves that artists work with. So it's kind of fun to learn about artists who've had a whole career and never had to like buy materials. Like they just collect it, like plastics but even the artists who work with plastics, have to worry about their health too, like wear gloves. And so yeah, art can be toxic. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, that's what part of my personal history. I was a decorative artisan. I did decorative arts for a number of years. And one of the reasons I moved into the environmental space is that I got my liver good and pickled by using all the toxic chemicals that I was using in my studio on a regular basis, trying to create 18th century finishes in an accelerated way.
Yeah.
And so we were constantly manipulating materials, lacquers and all kinds of things and layering things. And God knows that I started having these little mini seizures, and that was my indication that it was time to stop and clean up my act and my body. And so I moved. That was the impetus for me to go from the decorative arts into environmental sustainability. And then it kind of goes on from there. But it's interesting that I'm kind of circling back to this intersection of environmental concerns and the arts that seems to be following me wherever I go, which was why I was so excited to meet you, because you were the first person that I had met in a long time where that intersection was so clear, where that was such a prominent part of what you're up to. And I mean, I would imagine that with this huge community and base of environmental artists, that you would be available to them to catalog their work as they go forward. So this idea of legacy is something that could be a legacy project for you, I would imagine.
That's what I'm doing. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be called the Eco Art Space Legacy Project. And so, yeah, because like I said, even all the legacy work that I did coming from the Bay Area, they were all interested in nature. So it's all there. They weren't, living artists. So, I'm making the Eco Art Space Archive a part of the Living Artist Network at this point. I think, the ones who've already passed, we have lost like at least 3 or 4 of the kind of matriarchs and patriarchs of the eco art movement, but those estates are already, cataloged. And so I think it's better to start doing it before the artist dies.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
that's the message we want to get out to people. And I don't know if I've had a chance to tell you, but one of the initiatives that we're doing this season in tandem with this Art of Remembrance is I have a project that we're going to be unveiling inside of our Remains to be Seen exhibition, which is our companion exhibition to this podcast series. So if you know any artists that would fit into that category, let's have a conversation, because it's a 24/7 virtual exhibition. So we don't actually need the art. We just need images of the art and have their narrative tie into what we're talking about. And that would be a really great tie-in. But one of the things that we'll be revealing in that is my concept for something called Avon Fields, which is rewilding golf courses and turning them into memorial arts parks, basically using natural organic reduction, green burial, and just re-landscaping the land, using the infrastructure of the golf courses so that you have the greens and the topography of the land to be major art installations, and then using the rest of the ADA compliant and pathways and golf and parking lots and all of that. So I'd be curious to have a conversation with you about a little bit further about that, because it seems like it might be an interesting way for us to intersect.
So you're proposing this like for the Southwest?
We have yet to decide where we're going to do the pilot project, because we have to take into consideration which states have it legal to do the natural organic reduction, green burials, where it would be most cost effective to do it, where there are a plethora of golf courses available across the United States that are for sale and for not a lot of money, all things considered. In New York State, there's something in the range of 20 something or plus golf courses for sale right now. And a lot of what's happening is they're expensive to maintain. New golf courses get put up instead. And they are these toxic, they're toxic places. And they're learning that having a house on a golf course is no longer necessarily a bonus. And so some of the real estate values are declining around that. So there's lots of different layers to it, as well as people who are collectors of large sculptures don't necessarily have a place for them to go after they die. So it's this confluence of different ideas.
That's a nice project. I like that.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll be unveiling that soon, but this has been great. I'm so glad we finally got a chance to connect. And I feel like I've left a few threads out there for people who are probably thinking, okay, what's next for me? How can I take my family's bountiful collection of art of one particular artist, say, and what would be my next step? What would you say a next step? If it's not that well known an artist, what would they do with their work?
Another little piece of advice is that you really should find a curator or an art advisor, someone who has the expertise to come in, represent the artist or the estate. If you want to donate the work to a museum, when families try to do it themselves, it just shuts down, because the institutions, they're not going to trust you, first of all, because that's not your field of study and you haven't been out there curating shows. But it's also messy. It can be messy because they don't know if they take something that the other family member hasn't approved and then they're going to get in a lawsuit. Like there needs to be some vetting ahead of, just trying to give things to a museum. That doesn't work that way. But yeah, just, being organized, you need to have the information in a form that it can be available to people from far away, nearby, so they can make decisions around it. So yeah, and if you don't have a lot of support and you don't have a lot of money, you definitely should write something up and put that as a part of your will or living trust. And then, yeah, identify someone who you trust. And maybe if that person can't even do that work, that they can at least in the interim find that person to help you.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, that's great. And it just occurred to me, I should probably do a similar episode with somebody to advise people on their collections, not the collections of their own family members who are artists with that entire portfolio of work, but a collection like I have, which is a bunch of different artists. And what's the responsible thing to do around that? Great. Well, thanks again, Tricia. And I look forward to seeing you in Santa Fe, and we'll get together again really soon.
Sounds good, Lily. Thank you.
Okay, take care. So thanks for joining us today. ArtStorming is brought to you and supported by ArtBridge NM and listeners like you. Look for us on your favorite podcast platforms or wherever you listen. Your subscriptions, likes, comments, and shares help us to reach more listeners and attract the support we need to thrive in these challenging times. If you love what you hear, please consider making a contribution. We rely on your help to keep these conversations going. Every dollar you contribute goes directly into programs that support our mission. And we've been offered a matching grant that will match every dollar that you contribute. That means more compelling stories, more in-depth articles, and an even greater impact on our community. Please visit our website at www.artbridgenm.org, and thank you so much for being an essential part of our work.